So hello, thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Rebecca and I'm going to talk about the hidden language of anatomy. So I am a lecturer in anatomy here at Lancaster University. So I'm going to go over some very basic anatomy and language processing in the brain. I wouldn't be an anatomist, I didn't try to teach you all some anatomy at every opportunity. And then I'm going to talk about the etymology of some anatomical terms and how the language of anatomy is changing. And then finally, I'm going to touch on how students engage with learning new terminology in anatomy. So there are two main areas in the brain that are centred on language processing. At the front, in the frontal lobe, dominant hemisphere, which for most people who are right-handed, that would be your left-handed side of the brain, we have Broca's area. And it was discovered that this was important in production of speech after Broca examined two patients who were left unable to speak following injury to this area. We then have Wernicke's area, and this is in the temporal lobe of the dominant cerebral hemisphere. So again, if you're right-handed, your left hemisphere, and it's involved in comprehension of written and spoken languages. So if there's damage to this region of the brain, patients will speak fluently, but the phrases will have no meaning. And learning a language can actually improve or change your brain. I know I don't need to preach to converted here about language learning, but learning languages increases parts of the brain that are associated with language. So I've just put up two examples here. MRI studies have shown that learning a foreign language has a visible effect on the changes in the brain, and areas of the brain that grew most were linked with.
Sorry, I think there's a problem with sharing the slide. Just the apologies for the interruption. Just share. So let's see, language is not yet done. Okay. Yeah, so can everybody now see learning language increases parts of the brain associated with language? Yes, okay. Yeah, okay, so I'll just I'll let you continue.
Okay, I'll just go back to the last slide so you can just see where in the brain language processing occurs. So, as I mentioned, there are two main areas of the brain where language is processed. We have Broca's area, which is towards the front, and it's in the frontal lobe of the brain, and Wernicke's area, which is in the temporal lobe. So I've got some examples here of how learning language increases parts of the brain associated with language. So there's just two examples. There's been lots of studies on this. There's an MRI study that shows that the size of parts of the brain associated with language increases the more you learn languages. And then there's another study here that shows knowing another language is advantageous in preventing cognitive decline. And the interesting thing about this study was that it doesn't matter when you learn it. So it realised the authors studied people who learned it later on in life through whether they were married or moved country or whatever reason they needed to learn a new language. They found that learning a language at any age prevents cognitive decline. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about some anatomical terms. Anatomy itself comes from a Greek word for dissection, means to cut. First proper books on anatomy were written by Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Galen. And for this reason, most modern terms originate from either Latin or from Greek. The terminology was subsequently improved by Vesalius, Fabricius, and Harvey. Learning anatomy is learning a whole new language. We have different words for pretty much everything. We don't say front of the body or back of the body, we say anterior, posterior. We don't say top or bottom, we say superior or inferior. And medical students do sometimes find this a bit of a challenge when they first start at med school. There are set standards for international use of anatomical terminology, and the Terminologica Anatomica is gold standard for what all scientists around the world should be using when describing human anatomy. So I'm just going to talk through some of my favourite translations of words in anatomy. So first of all, we have the duodenum. This comes from medieval Latin, and it's for duodenum digitorum, which means a space of 12 digits. And I think, Tim, you mentioned that there's a good word for it in German as well?
This is a 12 figure.
Yes. So it's supposed to 12 digits, and that's because it's about 12 fingers long. So when students first start learning anatomy, they look at all these terms, they look at terms like duodenum, digitorum, and they think, how am I ever going to learn these words? But really, they were originally designed just to be descriptive. So this is another one of my favourites, has Anserinus, which translates as goosefoot. And this is a tendon that branches from the back of the knee, and it gives rise to three muscles, the brachialis, the semitendinosus, and the sartorius. And it's called the goosefoot because there are three branches, and it looks a bit like a goosefoot. Mastoid process, and for those of you in the audience, I did bring my skull to show you. So the mastoid process is a little knobbly bit just sort of behind your ear. You can all feel it. It's an important site of attachment for muscles of mastication for chewing. It's named because it is like a breast or a nipple. So I think that a man had to have named that because only a man could look at that little knobbly bit and think, looks like a breast. Pelvis. The translation of pelvis is a basin or a bucket. And the pelvis has got lots of terms that are quite nice and descriptive about it. It's actually made up of three different bones, and the two bones on either side are called the innominate bones, the bones with no name. Although how can it be a bone with no name if it's called the innominate bone? It is the question. And then if we look at a hemipelvis, a half pelvis, one innominate bone, the part where the femur sits inside the hip socket is called the acetabulum. And this comes from the ancient Greek or Latin word for liver cup. I don't know about you, when I have dinner parties, I don't instantly go to use a hemipelvis to serve condiments, but you know, I can see how it would do the job. The smallest bones in the human body are called the ossicles. That word itself means little bone, or little bones. And there's three of them. We have the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And again, these were designed just to be descriptive. Malleus translates as hammer, incus as anvil, and stapes as a stirrup, as in horse riding. And then the brain, which all the students know like neurology. They all freak out when we start neuroanatomy, particularly when you have words like lamina quadrigemina. But Gemina is like Gemini, the star sign symbol, and the symbol for the star sign is twins. So all quadremina means is four twins, and that's because there are four parts. Sort of translates more to quadruplets than more twins, but that's because there are four parts of this structure. The cerebellum is just the little brain. It's a tiny little brain at the back of the cerebrum, and it's got a role in motor function. Vermis, the worm. All these terms, they're just descriptive. Again, we've got another breast-like things for the mammillary bodies. So there are changes in the standardisation of anatomical terms. Particularly at the moment, the focus is in removing eponyms from anatomy language. There are some pros to having eponyms. They keep alive the history of how things were discovered and medical traditions and culture around how anatomy was first formed. But there are some cons to it. So eponyms lack accuracy and cause confusion. They're not the same country to country. People in different countries like to claim that they were both the first, so the eponyms will be different in different countries. They're very male, pale, and stale. Men love to name things after themselves. And by having all this inaccurate difference in terminology, it can hamper scientific discussion and cause confusion. The terminology and anatomica specifically excludes eponyms because they give absolutely no anatomical information about structure. Having eponyms, it also increases the amount of learning students have to do because they have to learn the eponyms and then more and the descriptive terms for them. So here are some examples. So we've got the fallopian tubes. The more modern name for these are the uterine tubes. Lipio didn't even discover the fallopian tube, so I don't know how he named them after himself. Galen got there first, and then René de Graaf, a French anatomist, figured out their function. So Galen definitely got there a few hundred years before Lipio did. The eustachian tubes are called the auditory tubes. And things like the Achilles tendon should be called the calcaneal tendon. It's just describing where in the body and what they're attached to. Some of them I actually quite like. I like the Achilles tendon. I like the history of why it's called that, relating back to the Greek mythology. But there are some terms that really do need to go, particularly terms, eponyms such as Clara cells. Max Clara was an Austrian scientist and he was a Nazi, and lots of his research into the physiology of lungs came from people who were in concentration camps. So that has been renamed club cells because the shape of the cells is slightly in shape of a club, if you look at packed deck of cards. Bundle of His, similar. His was a big believer in eugenics. So rather than calling it the bundle of His, we should call it the atrioventricular bundle. Okay, so that's all I really wanted to talk about. I was just going to use this opportunity. Would anybody like to collaborate? I have noticed in my teaching anatomy that students that have English as a second language, anecdotally, they seem to pick up anatomical terms quicker. And there's not been much previous research on this, and I've been wondering, is it because they can better translate terms by knowing different languages? Do you know the origins of different words better? I think it might actually just be because they're more confident in making mistakes with language. I always say to them, I do not care how you pronounce those. My biggest faux pas was when I once called the auditory meatus the auditory meatus. Lots of people laughed at me, but you know what, it's fine. We all learn definitely how to pronounce it. Or is there some other reason I've not thought about? And how could we use this to inform practice of medical education? So, thank you very much for listening to me. If you want to keep contact, please do. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. So what you mentioned about anatomical terms like European Elvis, as somebody who learns anatomy in German, words actually are much more connected to the languages. Ecke is Elvis, which actually means basic.
Right, okay.
Do we have any questions, Derek?
Same point, Tim. In Chinese, which I lectured, the terms are much more direct. So the duodenum is the 12-finger position, and so a Chinese speaker who comes to the duodenum makes that link. Possibly it would be easier for them to pick up the Latin, and also mastoid. I just looked these up, by the way. I didn't know off the top of my head. And the mastoid is the breast protrusion. So it's
interesting to know it's been conserved across languages then.
Yes, and I just forever marvel at why in the English-speaking world we hold on to these archaic Latin terms. Why can't we just translate them into contemporary English? And it would be doing ourselves a wonderful favour. Instead of calling it the duodenum, why don't we call it the 12-finger? I think it's absolutely crazy. And it's not just in anatomy, but across many fields of language that we hold on to these Latin and Greek terms, which give us no end of grief. Because we struggle to remember.
Actually, Derek, you bring up a wide question. Again, I'm just thinking about it. I think this is a problem with English in that other languages often have broad variations. So, for instance, in German, you would be able to refer to a duodenum, and that would still be understood. So you've got two variants. Often, shall we say, international words, again, just using German as an example, often incorporated, but then they're sort of Germanicized. And that actually, I think, leads to an enrichment of the language. But maybe because of the lack of influence of other languages on English, maybe English is missing some of the enrichment, at least in the which can actually come from other languages, at least in the last few centuries or so. but I guess that's a topic for a much wider discussion. But yes, certainly I have lots of ideas to collaborate, so I will certainly send you a mail. Sorry, one last question.
Oh, it has to be quick. Anyway, I was just thinking when you were talking about the terms, like anatomical terms, that it's kind of the Esperanto of the science world or
Yes.
the medical world, right? I also thought about the question that you asked at the end, like how do people whose native language is not English assimilate these words more easily. My own reflection is right away like trying to figure out where it comes from, and just like you explained to us also what could it mean. Of course, there's only words for Latin for me because I don't speak Greek, so that would be more difficult. But sometimes you have a lot of long words also from Greek that you're already. I was wondering if students are also helped in this way, that they, not only receive these textbooks and that they have to memorize these words, but that there would be like a step where people actually say to them, look at this word, you can recognize like parts of it.
So in my teaching, I definitely always try to explain to them where the words come from or where it's relevant. Some of them roll their eyes at me, going, "This isn't going to be on the exam, I don't need to know it," which is sadly a bit complicated for students. Some of them love it. It is when we learn helps again, like there's the ramas. Ramas means like a branch or a bridge.
Yeah.
It's just all these lovely terms. And I just want to sort of appreciate the beauty of it all as well as knowing what's going to be on the exam.
It really comes across, and I think that you have a humorous way also of presenting this, and this helps a lot. And I think I've seen this, I haven't been to so many science labs, but I think that people who come from the natural sciences are more prone to it, or have a better ability of being humorous in this way in which they present their scientific findings than humanities scholars are. Also, just quite quickly, my native language is Finnish, and I also know Icelandic, and they tend to have like descriptive terms for a lot of new stuff. For example, like a computer, for example, in Finnish would be a knowledge machine.
Amazing. I love that term.
I find that very cute as well. And the very last point that I wanted to make was about the Clara tube, where you have like this Nazi past, and I know that in, for example, Austria, they have been renaming street names, which can be very cost intensive and time intensive. I was recently in Liverpool, and I saw this on the street where you have like you have a lot of buildings named after a very wealthy man from history, and there was a sign stating that he had built all of this using slavery workers. So I don't know how it can be so different here on the island that you don't change it. Or it's not a problem.
We're actually a bit behind the time there.
Yes,
So
sorry.
thank you very much, Rebecca. We will continue to our next speaker, who is Reuben Thomas. Hello, Reuben. And
hello.
Reuben is many things, and probably to do him justice, we'd have to introduce him for 10 minutes. But I'll let him get on with his talk, which is a translation as user experience design.
Thank you, Tim. So I'm by academic background a computer scientist, by profession largely a church musician, and today I'm going to talk about something else that doesn't quite relate to either of those, which is translating poetry in the context of concert programs. And this talk is more of a provocation than a practical talk. Setting the scene. So this is actually how I started becoming interested in translation myself. I went to a song recital given by a friend, I'm a native English speaker. One of the song cycles that my friend was performing was in French, and translations of the lyrics were provided for the audience in the programme. It struck me at the time that the translation was rather unsatisfying that I was given in the programme for a number of reasons, and it started getting me thinking about translation of poetry and translation in this particularly specialised context. It involves aspects of translation we might not normally consider. So what I'm hoping you'll be thinking about for the rest of this talk and maybe afterwards is how this example might change the way we think about translation in other contexts, and also how skills that we bring from other areas might influence the way we think about translation. Here's the original text that I'm going to talk about. It's a short poem by Guillaume Apollinaire from his collection Le Bestiaire, the Bestiary, published in 1911. And this one is called The Dromedary, Le Dromadaire. And along with all of the translations that I'll be looking at shortly, I'm going to read it. Importantly, of course, as I say, it matters that it's set to music in this case by Francis Poulenc a few years later. Avec ces 4 dromadaires, dont Pedro d'Alfaroubeiral courut le monde et l'admira. Il fit ce que je voudrais faire si j'avais 4 dromadaires. So let's just look at a translation into English. And before we do that, I just want to say this kind of translation in particular is hard. The translators, I now quote, have my admiration and respect. I'm going to criticise the translations, but I understand that this is an extremely tricky thing to be doing. And there's a very nice example in extended form in Douglas Hofstadter's book, Le Tombeau de Marot, where he gives, I think, over 20 different translations of a short poem by Clément Marot. And it's when you start read through them all and maybe have a go at your own, you can see quite how tricky this sort of thing can be. So here's an initial translation to work with. This was actually published in the Scottish newspaper, the Glasgow Herald, in 1955 by Edwin Morgan. Don Pedro had 4 dromedaries. Don Pedro d'Alfaroubeiral had, and he rode around the world for a fad. The very diversion I'd organise if I possessed 4 dromedaries. So that's just to give you a sense of the poem. But we might now wonder what a concert audience's particular needs are. Well, just imagine you're sitting in a recital hall, listening to someone singing and someone playing the piano. In this case, it's a song cycle for voice and piano. So hopefully most of our attention is going to be on the performance. We want the translation that we're given to be easy to follow, so we're not distracted from the song. And maybe one of the most obvious ways in which we probably want it to be easy to follow is to match the original line for line. And maybe we'd like it to be in the same metre and rhyme scheme as the original, or maybe not. So I'll get back to that later. So, as you might imagine, this song cycle is sometimes actually performed in English. And there's a singing translation then written by Percy Pinkerton, which is in the standard French edition of the song cycle. And it goes like this. Once, with his dromedaries 4, did the gallant knight Don Pedro wander abroad to see the world. If I had dromedaries too, that is what I should like to do. So we might ask ourselves at this point, well, if this is a singing translation that a performer might actually sing, why not just stick that in the programme? Well, it has slightly different constraints. So a singing translation has to fit the melodic phrase, because you're not allowed to change the music conventionally in art song from what the composer originally wrote. So the importance of individual words, which often correlates with the pitch in the melodic phrase, the stress in the words, which again, certainly in Western European languages, tends to correlate with the length accorded to a syllable, say, in the melody, and also the mood. These all have to fit as closely as possible with the music. Notice that the translation I just gave doesn't actually rhyme. Well, it sort of does in the last line, but it certainly doesn't match the original rhyme scheme in full. And that's something we can get away with when we're singing, because meter and rhyme are much less obvious, especially in the less regular sort of melodies that one often finds in art song. So I've already mentioned meter. Indeed, we can sometimes get away with slight changes to the rhythm when we're singing in translation. We can, for example, fit 2 notes to 1 syllable, or we can split a long note into multiple notes. And also, finally, notice we've lost a key word from the original poem. There's no mention of Alfaroubeiral. And again, that's something we can get away with a little bit in a singing translation. And also, even it doesn't quite matter if it matches line by line or not, although in this case it certainly does. So let's have another go. Here's a translation by Michael Rosewall from leader.net, which is an excellent site for finding translations, the sort of translations that you might put in a concert programme of all sorts of art song in English, French, German, Italian, to name a few languages, and then translated into a vast array of languages, especially for the more popular songs. With his 4 dromedaries, Don Pedro d'Alfaroubeiral wandered and wondered at the world. I'd like to do just the same if I had 4 dromedaries. So how are we doing now? Well, this fits the constraints that we set ourselves. I do wonder about the bit I stumbled over just now, wandered and wondered, because there's that's a translation which very much draws attention to itself, and it doesn't actually match anything in the original French. The word for wandered, as in travelled around, is couru, which is more literally ran in English, and wondered, as in thought about or pondered, admira, which would more literally be admired in English. So maybe the translator there is slightly drawing attention to the translation rather than the original. We've lost the meter and rhyme scheme. At this point, I'm still jury out on whether that's a good thing or not. So can we do better? Well, let's find another site that has translations for concert programmes. Oxford Leader here, translation by Richard Stokes. With his 4 dromedaries, Don Pedro d'Alfaroubeiral roamed the world and admired it. He did what I would like to do if I had 4 dromedaries too. So how are we doing now? Well, we've actually got the meter. It's not entirely obvious when I read it out, but it fits. And we got a rhyme in the last 2 lines there, do and to, but is it a good one? It does actually, that's the one point where this translation breaks meter. There's an oddity that we may have noticed in the last couple of translations, which is this direct copying, as it were, from the French of d'Alfaroubeiral, which is obviously not English, and since the original Don is Portuguese, it's not obvious why we should be copying that precisely. Let's turn to a poetic translation from a complete translation of Le Bestiaire, here by X.J. Kennedy. With his dromedaries 4, Don Pedro of Alfaroubeiral wandered the world and savoured it. He did just what I'd like to do had I 4 dromedaries too. I must say I quite like this one, even though it's not designed, as it were, for a concert programme. We've got the meter to a T. That's obviously the sort of constraint that one's more keen to respect in a poetic translation. And we've got a rhyme that respects the meter. There's one word that pings out at me, savoured. Well, here admired wouldn't work because it would have the wrong stress in this line. Wandered the world and admired it. Whereas we have the more elegant wandered the world and savoured it. And notice also he's respelt Alfaroubeiral. This is maybe a more legible form to an English reader. So we're helping the reader a bit, which is certainly something we want to do in a concert programme. here's my entry. This is I call this trying to have it all, because here we try to respect the original rhyme scheme and meter, and have everything aligned to time. Equipped with dromedaries 4, did Alfaroubeiras young Don traverse the world, its sights to con. I'd like to make just such a tour if I had dromedaries 4. Well, how are we doing now? We've gained an absolute match for the rhyme and meter scheme of the original, but maybe we've lost a couple of things too. We've lost the name Pedro. We replaced that with a nod to his being a prince of Portugal, the young Dom. We've got this word equipped, which doesn't really have any particular relation to the original, rather like savoured in a previous translation. And the whole thing feels rather archaic. We've got this sort of switching around, swapping of word order that's typical of older English poetry. Dromedaries 4 rather than 4 dromedaries, and this rather archaic verb con, meaning to look at, scope out. The original French is entirely idiomatic, really, for its time. It feels quite modern for 1911. So, in a sense, this is a bit of a cop-out. And then just a small note about orthography again. Alfaroubeiral, this is actually the Portuguese spelling. Since it's not a place that's well known in English, arguably better to use the original language's spelling than try and anglicise it. So that's it. In conclusion, both the singing and programme translations aren't primarily aimed at the audience. I said earlier that we couldn't necessarily just use a singing translation for a concert programme, but they do have some things in common. They're both mainly aimed at the audience, and the constraints for them are both quite, as you might say, ergonomic, with respect to ease of comprehension, fitting to the music in the case of the singing translation, and the way in which we'd like to take it in along with the song if we're trying to read it as a member of the audience. This is why I'm not really sure, after all, that we should necessarily care about meter and rhyme, because maybe those in a translation in a programme are going to draw attention to themselves rather than to the original language in which it's being sung. And so, just to hopefully poke you a little bit, audience, to take something away, just wonder whether there are lessons here for prose translation in various contexts, where we may be interested in features beyond the mere conveyance of meaning, and also whether we could perhaps bring in other disciplines. I admit, somewhat bait and switch reference to user experience design in the title of my talk. I haven't talked about user experience design at all, but it does suggest that when we have these sorts of highly technical and ergonomic constraints on translation, then we might like to approach the task with a mindset beyond that of what one might usually regard as the translator's mindset. That's it from me. Thank you very much.